our session on chaplaincy. And I think we're going to be covering several different aspects of that. And I think we'll have some opportunities to ask questions along the way. This is not a preaching session per se. So if you have something that what about? Okay, stick your hand up in the air. And we'll chase some rabbits. We'll do what we need to do to make this as productive and helpful to you as possible. Mentioned last night. Yes, ma'am.
For live stream purposes, if you could restate the question so that.
All right. So whoever's up here behind the pulpit, make sure you restate any questions that come from the peanut gallery here. And then, let's see, where was I going before I was reminded of that? So whoever's up here, take care of that. David was involved in not hospital, I'll get it straight. Lost my train of thought. Fire department chaplaincy for 26 years. And I know we have another brother here that's doing some of that now. And then Brother Kaminsky is involved in the Coast Guard chaplaincy, and I'm sure he'll have a lot more to say about other options that are available that it can be authorized or endorsed rather through the FBFI. So we'll start with David, if you'd please come up and share what the Lord has for us.
What I'd like to do is I'll share some of my experience, and I'll share a couple of Bible principles, and then I certainly want to entertain any questions, and I know that there's some of you men that can make some significant contributions to this discussion. I first became a fire service chaplain in 1999, and I'm trying to remember back that far. The deputy fire chief of our local community was a member of my church. And he came to me on a Sunday morning, and he said to me, we had a terrible accident over the weekend, and I can remember reading about it in the newspaper, back when people used to read the newspaper. But I remember reading about it in the newspaper, and to be quite blunt, it was a snowmobile accident that involved a snowplow, and 2 teenage girls were decapitated. Hideous, horrible. And so anyway, this gentleman in my church, his name was Jim Jorgensen, deputy fire chief. He came to me and he said, we had this accident over the weekend, and the chief and I were talking about it, and we decided that our department needed to have a chaplain. And I'm just standing there listening to him. And then he said, and I told the chief that you would do a really good job. And I remember immediately thinking to myself a couple of things. The first thought I had was a memory from my youth. Do you remember when you got your driver's license when you were 16 years old? Did they require you to watch a film or a movie at the time? Do any of you remember that? Some of you do. They had us watch a movie. I remember it was called Signal 30, and it was produced by the Ohio State Police. And it was just a monstrous, terrifying film about traffic accidents. And they would talk about this person was driving drunk, and this person was speeding. And then they'd show the fire department extricating some mangled body from this car. And I can remember that. I was remembering that film, and I remember thinking, I don't want any part of that. I don't want to see that. And then, of course, I thought to myself, what do I know about fire service? Well, I know that fire trucks are red, and that firemen put the wet stuff on the hot stuff. That's what I know, which means I don't know much. And so I rather disingenuously said to Jim Jorgensen, when he told me that he told the chief I'd make a good fire chaplain, I should do it, I looked at him and said, well, I'll pray about it. Isn't that what you say when you don't want to talk about something? When you want to change the subject? That's what I said to him. I'll pray about it. But I felt a little guilty about that later on as I remembered this conversation. I told him I would pray about it. And so I prayed about it. I don't think I prayed about it fervently or gave it any lengthy period of time, but I did pray about it. And as I prayed about it and as I thought about it, only one thought kept coming to my mind. If I don't do this, who will? Will they get a Roman priest to do this? Will they get some United Methodist who doesn't believe the gospel to do this? And so I told Jim Jorgensen, I said, well, I've thought about it and I've prayed about it, and I will be happy to meet with the chief and talk about this. Now again, men, this is back in 1999. The internet was brand new. Now if somebody asks you about a subject, a topic you don't know anything about, you simply Google it. You simply say, Alexa, tell me about thus and such, and then the Antichrist will start talking to you there in your living room. But I didn't have resources like that. I went to meet with the chief, and the chief told me, he says, here's what we want. And in case you don't know, chaplaincy in emergency service, and in particular in fire service, is department specific. There is no state standard for fire service chaplaincy. So in other words, the responsibilities of the chaplain are essentially, what does the chief want? And in some departments, they have a chaplain where the chief wants somebody available for counseling after an incident. Other departments, they want somebody who will be on scene. And what the chief at the department that I worked for, initially Oakfield Township Fire Department, and shortly after Cortland Township Fire Department, both rural departments northeast of Grand Rapids, about 25 miles. What the chief there wanted was a combination of both, on the scene and counseling after. But he said to me, number one, we're not going to use you very often. He said, this is a rural fire department. And he said, we're not going to call on you very often. He says, what we will do is we will call on you when there's a fatality or a Med 1 emergency. And the thing that the chief at that time was particularly concerned about was an accident scene and having family or friends arrive on the scene and disrupting the performance of the emergency workers. He wanted the chaplain there to intercept them. He wanted me to be available for on-scene death notification. He wanted me available to talk to firemen if they had difficulties with what they saw. And again, I knew very little about this. It was more from my imagination, what I thought I knew, than what I did know. But he gave me, and again, this goes back, I said there was no internet. There was also no cell phone. And so he gave me a pager. Do you remember those things? He gave me a pager. And when he called me, he would call the pager, it would beep, and a phone number would appear, and I would dial that number. And that way, I did not carry a fire radio. I didn't need a fire radio because they did get frequent calls from somebody's CO detector went off, somebody's cat was stuck up the tree, and that kind of thing. They don't need the chaplain for that. So I had this pager. Well, I met with him probably, it was late afternoon, 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That evening, I went to bed. At 2 o'clock in the morning, my wife wakes me up. There's this shrill beeping sound going on in our house. She says, a fire detector's going off. And there was this green flashing light in our bedroom. And of course, I'm coming out of this deep sleep. I said, honey, I don't think it's the fire alarm. I think it's that pager the fire chief gave me. And that's exactly what it was. And so I told him that I would be willing to function in some capacity, even though I didn't know what I was doing as a fire chaplain. I told him that about 5 in the afternoon. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he was calling me. Now, he told me they would call me only infrequently. And I remember I reached for the pager, and I looked at my wife. She's lying there in bed. I said, honey, they lied. They lied to me because they were getting me out of bed that very night. I called the number, and I remember my first scene. I got out of bed, I quickly dressed, I jumped in my car, I drove to the accident scene, which was about 1.5 miles, 2 miles from my home, and a drunk driver had gone through a red light and had T-boned a minivan. The people in the minivan were injured. The drunk driver was not wearing a seatbelt and his window was down, and without being too vivid, he had come partway out of the driver's side window, and his truck had rolled over on him and crushed his head. He was killed. And so his body was there underneath the bed sheet. And I won't go into all the rest of the details, but that was my first exposure to fire chaplaincy. And it was, I'm going to use the word interesting. It was interesting, but I stayed with it. I was a fire chaplain for 26 years. Now, I did receive some training. I began to make some inquiries, and the Michigan State Police had a chaplain's training program to go with their training with their chaplain corps. And so I went to Lansing and took chaplain training with the Michigan State Police. That was interesting. It was all purely from a secular psychological perspective. I also audited Fireman 1. I never did get my certification. I never challenged the test. And to be quite blunt, the reason I never challenged the test to become a certified firefighter is I didn't want to be one. Meaning I didn't want to answer the calls for the grease fire in the kitchen and the CO detector that went off at night. I wanted to just function as a chaplain. So I did take Fireman 1 so I would understand more about fire service. To skip ahead, in the, it was probably 2009, I was working on a doctoral program at Bob Jones University. And I remember Dr. Steve Hankins, who was in charge of the doctoral program at the time, was the dean of the seminary. He told the students who were completing their coursework, and I was completing my coursework, so it was about time to start the dissertation. He said, remember this, he says, your dissertation is not your magnum opus, it's not your life's work, it is a final academic project. That helped me enormously. Because a lot of men who are working on a doctorate, they want to write a dissertation on that thing that consumes them most, the thing that is their greatest interest, the thing that occupies their deepest affection. And I always imagined that I would write my dissertation on some aspect of preaching or something like that. But when he said that, I thought to myself, fire chaplaincy is rather unique. And he also said they had a computer program where they had access to dissertations that were from all the evangelical fundamental schools all across America, whether it's Liberty University or even Fuller Seminary. I mean, from the full breadth. And he said, you can't write a dissertation on something that somebody else has already written. Well, how many dissertations have been written? Wow, you know. And so I thought about this. I thought, well, I think fire chaplaincy would be an interesting topic. And so I submitted the first stage of your dissertation project, if you're in a doctoral program at Bob Jones, at least it used to be, is you submit what's known as the prospectus. It's a 2-page paper. How hard can that be, right? Page 1, what you want to write. Page 2, why you want to write it. I was surprised to learn that this was extremely difficult for a lot of guys because Hankins would review it and too broad, too narrow, irrelevant. Somebody from Central Seminary wrote on this 2 years ago. And so there were a lot of guys who submitted this perspective twice, 3 times, 4 times, and they were very frustrated. I wrote this perspective, I gave it to Hankins, and 30 minutes later he came out of his office and said, I like it, write it. I thought, oh, that's good. But what he found in his brief 15 minutes of research was what I knew. There was very, very little available in the way of resources for training for emergency service chaplains, especially emergency service chaplains with a biblical orientation, somebody from a fundamentalist background. And so I spent the next 2 years of my life researching and writing this dissertation, which I did complete, and which, praise God, from whom all blessings flow, my dissertation committee approved. And what I'm grateful about is that dissertation did not just sit on the shelf in the Mac library at Bob Jones University collecting dust, but I know the FBFI has used it in their chaplain's training. Chaplain Joe Willis, Mike Asher have used it in their chaplain's training for Foundations Baptist Fellowship International. And I have had requests, and I've distributed over 100 copies of it in PDF form to chaplains from around America who've requested it. Quite frankly, I don't want to oversell the product. Looking back on it, if I go back and look this thing over, I'd give myself like a B minus. There are some things that I would improve and things that I would change, but what I wrote was what I'd wished somebody could have given me when I first was asked to serve as a chaplain. And so I'm grateful that it had some value. It was valuable for me, and it's been valuable to other fellows. I want you to look at a couple of Bible verses. Let me give you two simple principles, and then we'll open this up a little bit more. The first principle I want you to look at is found in Matthew chapter 5. Of course, in Matthew chapter 5, we have the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And there is a very familiar verse that, without being in any way patronizing, I think is often misunderstood. I want to back up. I want to begin by reading verse 13. Ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt have lost his savor, wherewith shall it be salted, or what will make it salty? It is thenceforth good for nothing but to be cast out and to be trodden under foot of men. Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. And it's verse 16 that I think is often misunderstood. Let me read it again. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. If you back up, Jesus says what about a candle or a lamp? You don't light a lamp to do what? To hide it. The issue of verse 16 is not illumination. The issue of verse 16 is location. Jesus has been talking about Christian character. But what he's saying here by way of application is that the transformed heart and the Christian life, the Christian testimony, is not to be kept hidden. It's to be made conspicuous. It's to be made visible. Now, Jesus obviously elsewhere says that when you give your alms, don't let your right hand know what your left hand's doing. We're not supposed to be showing off. We're not supposed to be doing good works in order that men might think well of us. But at the same time, Jesus here says that we are not to live our lives in isolation, and our Christian testimony is not to be hidden. And this, to me, is one of the primary reasons why I believe that chaplaincy is a ministry that gospel preachers ought to consider. It is not for everyone. And I hasten to say that. If you're an emergency chaplaincy, if you want to be a fire chaplain and you have hemophobia, which means you faint at the sight of blood, this is not for you. I was sitting in a question answer session at FBFI annual meeting last year, and I was sitting next to Commander Tavis Long, U.S. Navy. It's one of the kinder things anybody's ever said to me. I'm sitting next to him, and he just leans over to me. He says, "You fire chaplains, I don't know how you guys do that." And that, again, was coming from a commander of the United States Navy who has combat experience and has served many years as a chaplain, because there is a very ugly and frightening aspect to emergency service chaplaincy, especially if you're an on-scene chaplain. But let me give you this story, and then we'll move on to the second verse, and then I want to open it up for discussion and question. I was a chaplain for maybe a week, and the chief called me on the phone. He said, "I want you to go see Sam." Sam was a member of the fire department. Now, I attended training meetings. I had been on scene, but I'd only been a chaplain for a week, and somehow I had never met Sam yet. He was a member of the department, but I had not met him. And the chief said to me, "Listen, Sam's wife just ran off on him. He needs somebody to talk to. Will you go see Sam?" "I'll go see Sam." So I hung up the phone. I got Sam's address from the chief. I drove to a pretty rundown house. Walk up on the porch, knock on the door, long wait. Knock on the door. Door opens. Now, my brother will remember this. Do you remember when you used to have that tan-colored bathrobe? It was a terry cloth bathrobe with all the terry cloth pulled and hanging loose, like like long hairs and had stains. That was grotesque. It should have been shot and taken out with the trash. But my brother used to have a bathrobe like that. Sam was wearing a bathrobe like that when I knocked on his door at probably 1:30 in the afternoon. He opens the door. He's standing there. He's got a can of beer and a cigarette in the same hand. Who are you and what do you want? That's exactly what he said and how he said it. I said, I'm Dave Oliver. I said, I'm the new chaplain of the fire department. Chief asked me to come by and pay you a visit. Oh, come on in. So I go into his house. The house is a wreck. He puts down the beer can. He crushes out the cigarette. I didn't talk to him for 5 minutes before he said, listen, I want to tell you something. He says, this may surprise you. He says, but my mom and dad are Christian people. I grew up going to Sunday school and church, the Baptist church down in Grand Rapids, Michigan. When I was a teenager, I started running with some friends that my parents didn't like. I started dating girls that my parents didn't like. And me and my parents, we stopped communicating. We didn't get along. He said, I married one of these girls. And he said, day before yesterday, he said, she just ran off with my best friend. And he said, I did something I don't remember ever doing. I got down on my hands and knees and I prayed and I said, oh God, I have made a mess out of my life and I need help. And he looked at me and he said, and chaplain, that's why you're here today. Kind of gives you a chill. Providence, answered prayer, a light not under a bushel. By being a chaplain, I was in a situation that as a pastor, I wouldn't have been in. Had I gone to that man's door, of course, I wouldn't have known to go to his door. But had I gone to that man's door and knocked on his door and he opened the door and said, who are you and what do you want? And I said, well, I'm Pastor Dave Oliver, Ashley Baptist Church. That's as far as it would have gone. But because I was the chaplain, I was able to get in the home. Now that man, Sam, to make a long story longer, that man got saved, became a member of my church, and eventually became the chief of the fire department. And you'll forgive me for getting a little emotional. In my lifetime, I have had more than my share of honors. I have an earned doctorate. Maranatha Baptist University awarded me an honorary doctorate. I think so I could join their alumni association. But I've had some awards. But when I made what was to me a difficult decision to step down from fire chaplaincy, I was at the last fire department training meeting, and Chief Sam was there. And he got up in front of the men. And he said, I have an announcement to make. And this fire chief just started weeping. He said, I can't make it. And he sat down, buried his head in his hands, and started to cry. And so the deputy chief got up and announced that the chaplain was retiring. But God allowed me to have a testimony in front of a lot of good men. And I say good men. A few of those men were saved men. A few people, in the providence of God and the grace of God, got saved as a result of the testimony that I was able to have as a fire chaplain. Some of those men are rough as a cob, let me tell you what. But I was accepted into their orbit, and I was able to speak to these men. And sometimes I've had men show up at my house uninvited. They wanted to talk to the chaplain. I had firemen walk into my office. I didn't know they were coming. They wanted to talk to the chaplain. It just created opportunities. Being a chaplain created some marvelous ministry opportunities, testimony opportunities, and gospel opportunities. And so I told Brother Dave that being a chaplain has been an honor, it's been a blessing, it's been an educational experience. It has injured me. And I say that deliberately. It has injured me. I don't suffer from what sometimes is called post-traumatic stress. and I don't have traumatic injury. I cry sometimes when I didn't used to. And I think that's, you see enough dead children and enough broken hearts. It's hard, and that's why I say it's not for everybody. But what a great opportunity. What a great opportunity. I'm not planning to leave this world anytime soon. I'm relatively healthy. But I was having a conversation with my son a couple of weeks ago, and I don't remember why it came up. But he asked me, my youngest son asked me, he said, when you die, what do you want, Dad? I said, I want the gospel preached. And I said, I want my Bible, and I want my badge. Being a fire chaplain's been a great ministry. And so I commend it to you. So you're up there weeping, man. I don't want any part of that. But if you want something that will change your life and put you in a position to change the lives of other people by the grace of God, I recommend chaplaincy to you. Let me give you a second Bible verse, and then we'll open it up for discussion, questions. And I know some of you men have great experience in chaplaincy, and I'm sure you have something you want to contribute. Matthew 22. And this is simply to answer a question. This is a Baptist fellowship, and I don't mind wearing the badge Baptist. I'm glad to be a Baptist. My brother and I, for a short time, attended a country church in South Carolina, and the pastor down there one time got up in the pulpit. He said, "Somebody asked me what I'd be one time if I wasn't a Baptist. What would I be?" He said, "I told him I'd be ashamed." And I thought, well, that's good. Anyway, Jesus talks about the first and the great commandment. Someone asks him a question, verse 35. What is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, the first and the great commandment. The second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I want you to look at verse 40. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Jesus taught us to think in principles. In other words, if you'll love God and you'll love your neighbor, you will de facto find yourself obeying the law and the prophets. As Baptists, we believe in what is sometimes called the regulative principle. Are you familiar with that term, the regulative principle? The regulative principle is basically another way to say that we believe that the Word of God is our sole authority for faith and practice. That's the first and foremost of the Baptist distinctives. So what we do is governed by the Bible. Why don't we have cardinals and popes? Well, the easy answer is it's not in the Bible. Why don't we have nuns? I thought they had some at Bob Jones when I was there, but why don't we have nuns? Well, because it's not in the Bible. Why don't we have these sacramental ceremonies, and why don't we observe Lent? And that's becoming a popular thing even among evangelical churches. Well, it's not in the Bible. That's called the regulative principle, and it's pretty standard for Baptist thinking. Now, this is not a denial or a contradiction to the regulative principle, but the Bible tells us about apostles. It tells us about prophets. I don't believe those gifts are operational today. The Bible tells us about pastors, evangelists. It tells us about deacons. Where does the Bible talk about chaplains? And the answer is, it doesn't. So then, aren't chaplains just like cardinals and popes and nuns? And the answer is no. The answer is no. I believe that chaplaincy is the outworking of biblical principles. We don't have any trouble having a Bible institute. Where do we find Bible institutes in the Bible? Well, we don't. We don't have any trouble having hymnals. Where are hymnals in the Bible? Well, you could say the Psalms are a hymnal, but we don't see hymnals in the Bible. How about Christian camps? All right. I serve on the board of Camp Kobiak in Michigan, and we have a camp director named Aaron Wilson. Well, where is the office of camp director in the Bible? And the answer is, it's not. But I believe that this is a practical application and outworking of biblical principles. And so I can demonstrate, I won't take the time to do so or to debate if necessary, the biblical basis for Christian camping, the biblical basis for Maranatha Baptist University, the biblical basis for a rescue mission. But there is one. It's the outworking of principles. And I believe that chaplaincy is not like cardinals, nuns, and popes. I think that chaplaincy is an opportunity to be a Christian testimony outside of the local church, because that's what a chaplain is. A chaplain is a minister, and a gospel minister. That's what it used to be. Now there's rabbis and imams, but it used to be a gospel minister who functioned to provide spiritual help for institutions other than local church. And therefore there were military and our military chaplains, prison chaplains, hospital chaplains, police chaplains, fire chaplains. And I think it's a legitimate outworking of a biblical principle. So it's a great opportunity, and I think it's consistent with biblical truth, and I commend the ministry of chaplaincy. So there's my 20-minute presentation. All right? We got two men, I know maybe somebody else, but I know two men here who are serving as chaplains. Maybe you've got something you'd like to add to what I've said, and it might be that somebody here has some questions about chaplains.
Go ahead. So last year was the 250th anniversary of the military chaplain. And started the Continental Congress, and George Washington said, we need chaplains. And so it started, and it's been a part of our history, and it's actually a very noble part of our history. And the traditions in the military is such that they have chaplains there for different changes of commands and things like that. When I retired from West Side, I was approached to consider the chaplaincy for the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard is a unique situation, and I'd like to present this all to you because you probably have never even heard of it, but they have what's called ACS chaplains, which is Auxiliary Chaplain Support. In the Coast Guard, there's about 85,000 Coast Guards worldwide, and worldwide, there's only 45 chaplains that are active duty. And there's about 90 of us that are ACS chaplains. And so we are supporting the active duty. And when I was told about it, and there's not an age restriction because it is a volunteer position, it is a uniform position, it is a, you have a position of rank, and you have to have all the qualifications as a Navy chaplain, because the Navy provides the chaplains for the Coast Guard, Navy, and Marine. And so with that, you have to have an endorser, which is FDFI for me, and which would be for any of us. And then I had to take quite a few classes. I went back to the Naval Chaplain School and things like this. I don't have any military experience in my past, except my dad was a drill sergeant, and so I had 18 years of boot camp. But what you said is so true. When I show up at the station with uniforms, the officers in charge have a high respect for the chaplain. The young people treat me better than people in the church. And what I have found is, I'm 70, they're 20. I'm like their grandfather. But
There are limitations, but in 26 years, I've never found myself in a circumstance where I felt any pressure to compromise. Now, of course, the Bible says, be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. You don't walk up on an accident scene and look somebody in the face and say, if you were to die today, do you know whether you go to heaven? You know, it's probably not the best approach. But conversations often lead to gospel presentations. It's really wonderful how many different opportunities I've had. And whenever I was asked to speak, there's the open door. And time and again, I would be at a training meeting or something, especially seasonally, Easter, Christmas. I remember more than once the chief would get up there and say, well, it's Christmas season. Chaplain, tell us about Christmas. I'll be glad to. and there's the gospel message. And so I've had opportunity, if you want to call it preaching. I've preached to departments, but individual conversations, it really, when I say limitations, you have to be wise. But I've never been pressured to compromise, and there are really endless gospel opportunities. So.
What I find, when I went to the Navy chaplain school, I've always heard about the liberal chaplains and things like that. I'm finding more and more conservative chaplains and evangelical chaplains than not. We had one Muslim in that chaplain school, a couple Catholics, maybe a Seventh-day Adventists and Charismatics, but many of them were Baptist chaplains. It was very encouraging. I was greatly encouraged to see how many really want to get the gospel out.
The FBFI chaplains, and he's not here obviously, Colonel Joe Willis will say that the FBFI chaplains do well, they're promoted well, they're recognized well, and the military values them. Because quite frankly, in the military, and I can't speak specifically to it because I'm not there, I'm not a part of that, but there are military chaplains, and the reason they're military chaplains is because they couldn't function in a different environment in a local church. And quite frankly, they wanted the government benefits and so on and so forth. Well, the fellows from the FBFI, they look at their role as missionaries. We're here to serve God. So they're very involved, very purposeful, very deliberate, very interested, very caring. And because of that, they do their jobs very well. So praise the Lord for Colonel Willis and all the chaplains of the FBFI. Yeah. Let me say this about endorsement too. If you're a military chaplain, you have to have an ecclesiastical endorsing agency, Roman Catholic Church, Presbyterian Church USA, some sort of denominational structure like that. Well, obviously we're independent Baptists, and the government will not recognize a single congregation as a legitimate ecclesiastical endorsing agency. But that's where the Foundations Baptist Fellowship comes in, because FBFI has that status. And recognizing the autonomy of the local church and the authority of the local church, FBFI will come alongside the local church and provide that endorsing status for a chaplain from a local church. So it's a wonderful service that FBFI provides. They also provide training as well as the endorsement. Fire service chaplaincy is department specific. I did not need an ecclesiastical endorsing agent the way the military requires. Some fire department might. My fire departments did not. And I was actually approached by Joe Willis. I didn't ask him if I could be endorsed. He asked me, can I endorse you? And but what he was wanting is he wants the chaplaincy umbrella to be military, hospital, emergency service. And so I told him, absolutely, I believe strongly in what you're doing, and so I'll very gladly and be very happy to be an endorsed chaplain of Foundation Baptist Fellowship. Yes, sir.
So one of our folks has written a book, Triumph Over Trauma. Right. And it is very, very good.
So you can find it on Amazon. Triumph Over Trauma, Gary Fisher and Jeremy Van Linder. He's
The Bible tells us David encouraged himself in the Lord his God, but David had a traumatic experience, and the Bible tells us he wept until he had no more strength to weep. And sometimes the things that we experience in life are overwhelming. And as a fire service chaplain, when I used to get the call, I always prayed. It wasn't a written prayer, but I always prayed, "Oh God, give me the tongue of the learned, that I may know how to speak a word in season to him that is weary." I didn't want to say the foolish thing. I didn't want to say the wrong thing. And sometimes when you get on scene, you don't say anything. You wait until you see what's going on. But when you get on scene, I think Dave said it yesterday, many times you get a fire department call. You are being called into the worst day of someone's life. And the things that you experience, the things you see are amazing, horrible, but amazing. But God is there, and it's one of the things that's so interesting. The most rude thing that anybody ever said to me in 26 years of chaplaincy was no thank you. And there are people, they don't care about church, they don't care about the Bible, they don't care about any of that. But in the midst of the crisis, when the chaplain's on the scene, it's without being sacrilegious, it's like God is here. Help is here. It's amazing how welcome you are when the crisis happens. Did you want to add anything, Dave? Did you want to talk about it?
I was just going to say what you were saying there. It's very possible you, as a believer in Christ, are most of my experience is at traumatic scenes. I deal more with that than the fire personnel themselves. But when it was said to me this way: when you show up on scene as a chaplain, you may be the only believer there. You may be the only representation of God there. And there is a palatable difference from fire staff telling me when a chaplain is there versus not a chaplain there. And they are so thankful when chaplains show up to handle the spiritual burden. And who better than a believer in Christ?
Very good. Comments or questions? Yes, sir.
I was just going to say, when I was in Wenatchee, that it was shortly before I left, it was a couple of years, I think. I don't remember, it's when I was young. So Pastor, he was with Dr. Vaughn there in South Carolina, Bob.
Dr. Cobb.
Got his last name now.
I know exactly who you're talking about.
Yeah, he was a chaplain down in California.
Keller.
Bob Keller.
Donut Keller,
Yeah,
right?
so he was a chaplain in Pomona, California, and he came up this way, up to our church in Wenatchee, and he said, "I'm gonna go visit the sheriff's department." So he goes down there, and he found out they were looking for chaplains, and so me and the other man in our church, we went down there, and they had I'm trying to remember, one of the captains, or chief, I can't remember what it was, but he was sort of the liaison to them, and there was like 5 of us, the 2 from my church, and then they were evangelical guys, but we started a voluntary chaplain there, and so did some ride-alongs. I had one guy, it's a long story, but I got to visit him in his home. He made a profession, but I don't know if it was, genuine. But there were some times we went out, someone was lost up in the hills, and so they called me to come out there and talk to the family. So there was some opportunities there. And similar, where we're at in Kent, there's a T there, and there's an accident every month and a half or 2 where someone, hits someone else. And so whenever we hear that thing, I always try to jump over and get over to the corner and, where the accident was. And I just found people are so open to pray. I say, hey, a lot of times the police aren't there yet, so I say, hey, can I pray for you? And so I've never seen fruit from it in our church, but, been able to talk to people. They're very, back to what you said, they're very open during that crisis moment.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very strong testimony, and it puts you in contact with people that you would not normally be in contact with. When I was sitting in that panel discussion at the FBFI annual meeting, someone asked a question about chaplaincy and its relationship to pastoring. And I did not find for myself in 26 years any conflict between pastoring and chaplaincy. And I stress that being a chaplain, an emergency service chaplain, a fire chaplain, police chaplain, you're not moonlighting. It's not like I'm the pastor of the church and this is my side job. My church understood that my chaplaincy was a part of my ministry. It was an opportunity for our church to have a more visible civic testimony. And so it wasn't something I did in addition to pastoring. I looked at my chaplaincy as part of my pastoring, part of doing the work of an evangelist, putting myself in a strategic position where I could be visible and perhaps have a gospel opportunity.
Where else do I get opportunity to minister as their chaplain to 150 seamen, and when I was in ministry, door knocking and evangelism, those kinds of things, but I felt like my influence with the lost was diminished as a pastor because we're so involved with the ministry. And now as a chaplain, it's like I'm just surrounded by lost people. And it's very, very rewarding that they want you to be around. And you're helping Christians too that are in there that their faith starts wavering a little bit, that are in these stations. And you can encourage them to get involved in the church and get them and help point them in direction. I bought 100 Bibles, military family Bibles back 6 years ago. I didn't know why I bought them and everything. Well, now I'm able to give them out, and they'll come to me and I'll say I've got Bibles. They'll come and say, "Chaps, can I have a Bible?" And I've given out a dozen Bibles in just a year's time as they come and want them, and it's like I say, I'm going to be seeing two officers in charge on Thursday that used to be the officers in charge in my stations where in Oregon. Now they're up at Cape Disappointment in the surf school, and we're going to have lunch together and be able to visit with them, see their new places, and they invited us to come to lunch, and it's just, you're welcome. It's such a different world.
Yes.
I haven't thought of this before. When this church was first started for 3 years, I worked in a crane company, a block and a half from here. And because they knew I was a pastor, they issued me a business card that said chaplain. I was a delivery driver, just about things, but I was company chaplain, sort of an informal thing.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how many times I had opportunity. Somebody comes to me, they're going through something at home, and the boss knew, that's how I got hired there, because he was a Christian man, and he allowed me the latitude to talk to different people that were there, dealing with family struggles. When 9/11 happened, we're on the job, and everybody was really shaken. They gathered together and asked me to pray. Just different opportunities. And then people come, because of that, people are coming up and asking me other questions.
Yeah.
And so, even though that was an informal thing, I was the company chaplain, and it created opportunities that I otherwise wouldn't have had.
Chaplaincy has various expressions. I know my brother and I both know personally the chaplain for the Detroit Tigers. They have a chaplain? They do. And he holds Bible studies with them on Sunday morning when they have home games. But there are large factories that have an industrial chaplain. There's a man on scene available to help the employees. Chaplaincy really has limitless expressions. But I would like to broaden it. We preached about do the work of an evangelist. And I'm not disparaging anything. I'm all in favor, go out and knock on doors. I don't have a problem with it. Our church has a bus ministry. COVID nearly killed it. We had 50 kids, now we're 15 and it never rebounded, but we still operate a bus ministry. But I think there was a time when independent Baptist churches, evangelism, soul winning, it was revival meetings, door-to-door bus ministry, and that was it. And I'm not disparaging those expressions, but I think we need to be innovative. Without compromise, we need to be innovative. And whether it's having an exchange Bible study or a podcast or being a chaplain, I think if we If we pray and think and use our imaginations, there are different ways that we can have some innovative evangelistic opportunities.
One thing that I thought was interesting, there was one ride along that I was doing, so I'm with them, 4 or 5 hours in the car. And as we were talking, I don't even remember what it was that came up, but it was like a liberal view of letting the criminal go, or get out of jail free sort of thing. And I said, well, the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible's for justice and righteousness, to do it with mercy, and I went through some things. He goes, really? And he didn't have the clue that that's what the Bible says. And I would often in the ride along, I'd bring up, Romans 13 and how that you're a minister of God's hand, and they go, what? And then I could explain it and open things up, but it would often be, to me, on just the short amount I was doing it, on some of those conversations, it was like really enlightening to the police officers that there was a conservative side of religion. I mean, that was, at least my experience, and I didn't have a lot of influence there, but at least those ride-alongs were like, what? I've never heard of. Because one guy was telling me he got written up in a hunting fishing magazine. He had a shot on a big elk or something, and it was all there. And he said he got vilified by some people. And I said, well, what's? He said, yeah, because I had a gun and I shot this animal. And so he was surprised. He said, oh, man, good job. So that was part of the light shining. That it was
Yes.
so I shared the gospel, but just that aspect of viewpoint from God's viewpoint was totally foreign to
Yeah.
some people.
Yeah. Did I see your hand? Yes, sir.
So I pass by Firehouse 72 every time I go to church. And I've often wondered, how would I go about it? Do I walk to the front door and say, do you guys have a chaplain? What would I do?
Chapter 4 of my dissertation.
So I have wondered about this a lot. It's right there. I see it every day I go by this firehouse. It's 5 minutes from my place.
Well, that's not a bad idea, but there's a way to do it, but that's not a bad idea. Most fire departments do not have chaplains. Many do, but the majority do not. And that does not mean that the majority are not open to the idea. Most every fire chief and fire officer is aware of the concept. And there are actually reports that recommend the establishment of a chaplain corps that have been published by both federal and state fire organizations. Most people don't know he was Roman Catholic, but on September 11th, when the Twin Towers fell, fatality number 1, according to the coroner's office, was a New York Fire Department chaplain. He was hit by falling debris. And it's a little bit of dark humor. It was a day or two after that happened. I was on my way to a men's retreat with some men in our church, and a fella in the van said, "Well, it's a good thing you're a chaplain, you're not a fire department. You chaplains, nothing ever happens to you." And I folded the paperback that I was holding, and I showed him the picture of the body of the chaplain being carried out of the wreckage. He goes, "Oh." So there you go. But no, I'm not a first responder, and I stayed out of the hot zone.
Memorial here, 6 years ago, he spent 20 minutes going through all the lists of names trying to find that chaplain.
I found his name, and then we went to Engine Company 10, and it's kind of a fire department thing, trading patches. And I went into Fire Company 10 and gave them an Oakfield Township fire patch, and they gave me an Engine Company 10 fire patch. I have it on my bookshelf. So let me say this, and I meant what I said. If I was going to grade my dissertation, I'd give it a B minus. I think there's things I'd do differently and things I wish I'd said and things I could have expanded on. However, I did say that I have distributed a great many of them by a PDF format. And if there's somebody here that would like to have a copy of that, I will be very happy to send it to you electronically. If you think it would be an interesting resource or it would in any way be a help to you, I'd be happy to get a copy of it. But how to establish a chaplaincy program in a fire department. It's in there. So. Anyone else? Questions, comments? Yes, sir.
So when you were doing that, you were kind of stationed to one fire department, so you didn't have to like move around a lot like in the Army where you move a lot.
No, I lived at home. The fire departments I served two fire departments, both northeast of, they were neighboring fire departments. There were, and talk about, you said that people would invite you. I had a couple of other fire departments ask me if I would serve as their chaplain, and I told them no, simply because, I could only spread my butter so thin. I did get calls from some fire departments in an emergency, a couple of other townships that I served. One had a chaplain, and I don't know what the deal was. It was the last summer I was a chaplain before I retired, and this department's chaplain went on vacation, and they called me 3 times in 1 week. Thought, that guy better get home from vacation. That's all I have to say about that. But our fire department only had 2 career firemen, and what I mean by that is full-time paid firemen, and the chief of each department was full-time. The others were what we call paid on call. Sometimes they're called volunteer, and different places have a different attitude towards that. We kind of shun using the term volunteer. 2 reasons. Number one, they are paid on call. I mean, when they're at training meetings and when they're on scene, they are paid. But it pays, I guess you'd call it like part-time job. But the reason I don't like, and we don't like the term volunteer, is that people perceive that a volunteer fire department firefighter has less training than a career firefighter. But that is not true. They have exactly the same training, exactly the same certification. So a volunteer fireman is no less professional, no less qualified than a career fireman. But these gentlemen have their own jobs away from the fire department. Yeah.
How often did you get called?
It ran hot and cold. I would go a month without a call. I would get 3 calls in a week. And then, of course, I always went to training meetings, and the departments met twice monthly for training. And we would do everything from going over paperwork to, I've had my CPR certification 43 times, In fact, being the chaplain, I was the victim often. I can't tell you how many times I was extricated from a wrecked car. They would have one brought in from the dump, and I'd somehow manage to finagle my way into it, and they'd cut me out of it and board me and whatnot. But so I went to training meetings, but it really varied. And then I might have a call, and I'd be there 45 minutes. I might have a call, and I'm there for 12 hours. I got that too. But it just varied. And there were times where I would be on a scene, and then I'd go to someone's house. I'd be on a scene. I'd go to a hospital. It varied. Yeah. So, but again, in the providence of God, I never found myself in a situation where, like, I'm supposed to be at a Bible study. I'm supposed to be at a church service, or it just always seemed to work out. I remember one time I never went to bed. I was up all night and then went home, put on my suit and went to church and preached. It felt rotten, but I never had any conflicts like that. So, anybody else? Let me encourage innovation in ministry without compromise, and let me recommend chaplaincy. I think it's a great ministry opportunity.